When the explosion tore through reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on April 26, 1986, it sent not only a plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, but also millions of invisible fractures through human lives. Entire communities were uprooted, families torn apart, futures stolen by fear of an invisible enemy. Within days, more than 100,000 people were evacuated from the contaminated lands of northern Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Towns and villages were emptied, homes abandoned, pets left behind. The authorities called the area the Exclusion Zone, a 30-kilometer circle of silence meant to remain uninhabited for centuries. But within just a few years, something remarkable began to happen. Despite official bans, soldiers with rifles, and the ever-present specter of radiation, a small group of elderly villagers returned. They slipped past the guards, walked down familiar dirt paths, and opened the doors of houses where the clocks still hung, stopped at April 1986. They planted potatoes in irradiated soil, fed chickens in abandoned yards, and rebuilt lives in the shadow of catastrophe. These people became known as the Samosely, a Ukrainian word meaning self-settlers. Today, their stories remain some of the most haunting, human, and paradoxical legacies of the Chernobyl disaster. Why they came back for the Soviet government, the exclusion zone was an uninhabitable wasteland. For the evacuees, it was home. Most of the Samosely were elderly peasants, people whose roots in the land ran deeper than any fear of radiation. When asked why they returned, their answers were disarmingly simple. This is my land. My parents are buried here. I cannot die in a stranger's house. Better to live short and free than long and miserable. For many, exile in concrete apartment blocks of Kiev or other cities was unbearable. They were farmers, accustomed to waking at dawn, tending animals, breathing the smell of fresh earth. In the city, they felt like prisoners, useless, rootless, strangers. So they went back. Life in the zone. At its peak in the 1990s, there were around 2,000 Samosely scattered across more than 200 villages. Most were in their 60s and 70s, though some were younger families determined to cling to ancestral soil. Life in the zone was both ordinary and surreal. They planted gardens, gathered mushrooms and berries, fished in the rivers, and even distilled homemade vodka. They kept goats, chickens, and pigs. But the silence was everywhere. Houses stood empty, streets overgrown with weeds, schools filled with dusty desks and books no one would read again. Wolves and wild boar roamed the roads. The Samosely lived in a half-world, surrounded by ghosts of neighbors who had never returned. Occasionally, officials would try to evict them again, warning of radiation, cancer, invisible death. But the old villagers simply shrugged. "We survived the Germans, the famine, Stalin. We will survive this too," they said. The cost of staying radiation was, of course, real. Studies showed higher rates of thyroid disease, cancer, and other illnesses among those who remained. Many Samosely died earlier than they might have elsewhere. But there is a profound paradox here. Researchers discovered that those who returned often lived longer than those who stayed away. Not because radiation was harmless, but because exile was soul-crushing. Loneliness, alienation, and despair killed more surely than contaminated soil. For many of the elderly, psychological survival mattered more than physical safety. To live out their last years in dignity on familiar ground was worth any price. A community of the forgotten. The Samosely became a community of outlaws and survivors. They helped each other, shared food, patched each other's roofs, buried each other in the village cemeteries. When journalists and researchers visited, they often found humor as well as tragedy. Old women joked that radiation made their potatoes grow bigger. Men offered homemade moonshine, laughing that it was extra strong thanks to the fallout. Yet beneath the jokes was wisdom forged by suffering. These were people who had survived collectivization, the Holodomor famine, the Second World War, Stalin's purges. For them, radiation was just another hardship in a century of hardship. Philosophy of the Samosely. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of the Samosely story is the philosophy they embodied. They rejected the idea that life is only about safety, longevity, or conformity. They chose meaning over comfort, belonging over health, freedom over fear. In the words of one old woman, "Better to eat berries from my own forest and die in a year than eat white bread in Kiev and die of sorrow." The Samosely remind us of a truth that modern societies often forget. Humans are not just biological organisms. We are creatures of memory, roots, and spirit. For them, home was worth more than life itself. The last survivors today, only a few dozen Samosely remain. Most have died. Some were buried in the very cemeteries Soviet officials once said would never be used again. The youngest are now in their 70s or 80s. They live without running water, without modern health care, without shops. Volunteers and visiting scientists sometimes bring supplies. Tourists occasionally stop by, fascinated to see real people living inside the forbidden zone. Their days are quiet, tending gardens, feeding chickens, walking through forests that have reclaimed villages. Some live alone for months at a time, speaking only to the animals or to the graves of loved ones. When asked if they are afraid, they simply smile. Of what? I am old already. Death is everywhere, but here I am at peace. Legacy of the Samosely. The story of the Samosely is not just about Chernobyl. It is about the meaning of home, the resilience of the human spirit, and the defiance of ordinary people against faceless authority. In their stubbornness, they became symbols of something larger, the refusal to be defined by fear. While governments argued about radiation levels and scientists measured contamination, the Samosely simply lived. Their presence in the zone also reshaped our understanding of what it means to survive. Survival is not just about avoiding danger. It is about holding on to dignity, identity, and love. A silent testament. As the last of the Samosely pass away, their villages will return fully to the forest. Their houses will collapse, their gardens vanish, their names fade. But their story remains, a testament written not in monuments or books, but in the stubborn beating of human hearts. Chernobyl's Samosely remind us that sometimes to live fully, one must defy reason. Sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply to stay.